So welcome everybody to the first meeting of the spring 23 edition of the Western Hemisphere Virtual Symplectic Seminar. We're happy to kick things off with Kai Smith from Indiana University, who's going to tell us about character varieties and singular instanton homology.
Thank you for the invitation to talk. So I'm going to talk about how character varieties can be used to study knots, and the motivation for that comes from singular instanton homology. So I'll start by talking about that. So singular instanton homology is a knot homology theory defined by Kronheimer and Rofka. We'll denote it by I natural of K, and it has two main features. Firstly, it detects the unknot, and also there's a spectral sequence from Kovanov homology of the mirror to I natural of K. And putting those two things together, Kronheimer and Rofka showed that Kovanov homology detects the unknot. So that's an important theorem, and the only way to prove it so far is through singular instanton homology. So, that at least tells us that singular instanton homology is something worth studying and understanding better. And so that's sort of the goal. So let's go through the construction of singular instanton homology. So to do that, give you a quick rundown of the gauge theory basics in case anyone doesn't know them. So in gauge theory, you want to study principal G bundles over space X. So in the schematic, I just have a circle bundle over a circle. And to study the bundles, we'll look at connections. And a connection is just the data necessary to lift a path from the base space to the total space in a G equivariant way. So once you know where the start point lifts, the connection tells you where the rest of your path lifts. It tells you, how you move along the fiber direction. To study connections, one can look at the holonomy. So if you have a loop in the base, when you lift it upstairs, you'll end up on the same fiber, but not necessarily in the same place along the fiber. And so the holonomy keeps track of this movement in the fiber direction along a loop. So for any loop in X, you get an element in G, which tells you how you've moved along the fiber. And then a special type of connection is a flat connection. Those are the connection whose holonomy around any loop only depends on the homotopy class of the loop. So if you isotope the loop downstairs, that's not going to affect the holonomy upstairs. And so this is equivalent to the homomorphisms from pi1 of X to G. This is because if you have a flat connection, taking the holonomy gives you this homomorphism. And you can go the other way. If you have a homomorphism, you can specify, you can find a flat connection with the prescribed holonomy. And then the last sort of basic idea is the gauge group, which is just a fiber preserving automorphism covering the identity on X. So as an example here, there's this Dane twist on this torus. It's a fiber preserving automorphism of the torus, but it's still the identity down on the base. And one thing to note is that this acts on connections. So I started with this connection, but now after I do the Dane twist, this loop gets lifted in a different way. So using those, we can construct the singular instanton homology, and really this is the reduced version. So today we're just going to simplify things, worry about knots in S3, even though it's really more general. So you start with your knot in S3, and we're going to add something called an earring, or maybe an atom, depending on where you're reading about it. But if this is a strand of my knot, then the earring is just a meridian of that knot, along with an arc that connects the knot to the meridian. And so as part of a knot, this is what that would look like. And so once we have this, we can consider the principal SU2 bundle on S3. And we're interested in the set of all connections on this bundle whose holonomy around a meridian of the knot or this loop limits to a traceless element of SU2 as you pull it tighter and tighter. Similarly, if we have a meridian around this red arc, as we pull it tighter and tighter, we want the holonomy to limit to -1. And so we're considering the space of connections, but really what we want to study is the space B, which is these connections modulo the gauge group. And the idea is that we're going to study this knot by instead studying this space B. And the reason we added that earring is because without it, there are reducible connections in A, which the gauge group doesn't act freely on. And so if you just take the moduli space without the earring, you're going to have some tricky singularities that cause problems. And so adding the earring gives you a nicer moduli space. So to study this space B, you take the Floer homology, which is sort of the infinite dimensional version of Morse homology with respect to the Chern-Simons functional, which takes in a connection mod gauge and gives you a real number mod the integers. And to get our chain complex, the generators come from critical points of the Chern-Simons, which end up being flat connections in B. So combining what we know about flat connections with what we know about this holonomy condition, that tells us that any of these flat connections for any meridian of the knot or this circle, the holonomy must be traceless. And similarly, any meridian of this red arc must have traceless holonomy. So those are the generators, and the differentials are given by instantons, which are connections in S3 cross R, satisfying something called the anti-self-dual equation, limiting to flat connections on either end of the R factor. And so with these generators and differentials, you can take the homology, and that gives you the singular instanton homology. But you can see that if I gave you a knot, it would be really difficult just based on this definition to determine what the instanton homology is. This isn't the friendliest definition to do calculations with. And so in light of that, we might consider the Atiyah-Floer conjecture, which says that any instanton homology should have some isomorphic Lagrangian Floer homology. And so the idea that was sort of initiated by Hedden, Herald, and Kirk is to find the Atiyah-Floer counterpart for this singular instanton homology. And that would hopefully allow one to, make a lot more computations of instanton homology, and just, with a different perspective on it, should tell you a lot about it. So before I can explain what the idea is, there's a couple key definitions.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So on the previous slide in the construction here, where does the knot enter this construction?
Yeah, so the restrictions on the holonomy of your connection have to do with the holonomy as you go around the meridians of your knot. So the connection itself is singular along the knot, and then the holonomy is restricted around the meridians.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions so far? Yeah, so we want to look at this instanton homology from another perspective. So to do that, we'll introduce the notion of a character variety. So for space X, we're interested in the SU2 character variety, which is the space of homomorphisms from pi1 of X to SU2, modulo conjugation by elements in SU2. But we're really interested in knots, and we're going to use tangles too. So we're interested in some relative version of the character variety. So if we have T, which is some codimension 2 properly embedded manifold, submanifold of X, this relative character variety is known as the traceless SU2 character variety. And it's defined to be the representations mod conjugation in the complement of T, such that the meridians of T are sent to traceless elements of SU2. And we're going to further impose that if our knot or tangle T has an earring, that extra arc, the meridian of that arc must be sent to -1. So that should seem, conditions should seem sort of familiar from the last slide. After all, we're sort of trying to capture some of that same information. I'm going to do a sort of example on the next slide. And I'll just say that the way I like to think about SU2 is as through the identification with the unit quaternions. And so the traceless elements of SU2 are equivalent to the traceless unit quaternions, which are homeomorphic to the two-sphere. And when we talk about this conjugation by SU2, that acts on this two-sphere by rotation, and any rotation is possible by some conjugation. So let's talk about sort of the key example, which is the four-punctured sphere. So I have my sphere, and it has these four punctures. You could ignore the colors there. So I want to figure out its traceless SU2 character variety. So from the last slide, the sphere is X, and my codimension 2 submanifold T are these 4 points. And so the fundamental group of this guy is just generated by these 4 loops, A, B, C, and D, that go around the punctures. There's the relation that, D, if I slide this behind the sphere, is the same as doing C, A inverse B. And of course, I'm interested in the meridians, and those are just A, B, C, and D themselves. So what is the character variety? So remember, we're allowed to conjugate. So wherever we would send A, whatever traceless element of SU2 we would send A to, we can rotate, I think of it as rotating our sphere of traceless units of quaternions so that A ends up being sent to I. So using our freedom to conjugate, we can always send A to I. Next, wherever B gets sent, we can still rotate around the I axis and make sure that B ends up on the circle that's orthogonal to K, so sort of that IJ circle of traceless unit quaternions. And furthermore, we can specify that it's on one half of our circle. If it's on the other half, we just do a full 180-degree rotation and send it to the first half. So as a result, B is sent to something of the form e to the gamma ki, and gamma is somewhere between 0 and pi. So we know where A and B go. Now, if we know where C goes, then D is determined. So a priori, C could be sent to any traceless element of SU2, but in order to make sure that D is sent to a traceless element, it turns out that C must be of the form e to the theta ki, which means it's on that same circle orthogonal to K. And in this case, it can be anywhere along that circle, so we'll let theta range from 0 to 2 pi. So far I've described this rectangle's worth of spaces that parameterizes our representations. So theta determines where B gets sent, or sorry, gamma determines where B gets sent, theta determines where C gets sent. And first of all, it's easy to see we can identify the top and bottom edge. It's a circle, so 0 is the same as 2 pi. What's a little more interesting are along the left and the right edge, we get some identifications. Those come from the fact that along these edges, B is sent to plus or minus I. And so we sort of get some of our freedom to rotate back because we're not using it to fix B. And so there are 2 positions for C to lie in this circle that are equivalent by a full 180-degree rotation about the I-axis. So that gives us these identifications of this half of this edge with the other half of this edge, and same thing on this edge. And so this resulting space is homeomorphic to a two-sphere with 4 singular points, and it's called the pillowcase. So you can probably see if you fold along this crease and then glue along the edges, you would get something that looks like a pillowcase. So that's where that comes from. And then results from Atiyah, Bott, and Goldman tell us that whenever we have the character variety of a surface, the smooth stratum admits a natural symplectic structure. So in this case, the smooth stratum of the pillowcase is this two-sphere minus the 4 singular points. So it's sort of a coincidence that the smooth stratum of this moduli space is also the four-punctured sphere, but that's different than the four-punctured sphere we started with. And so this four-punctured sphere admits a natural symplectic structure. So how can we use this to try to get a knot invariant? So the strategy set forth by Hedden, Herald, and Kirk starts with your knot. And then, just like before, we want to add an earring. Then we're going to find a sphere which intersects the knot in 4 points. Using that, we can decompose our knot into 2 tangles. And it's helpful to note that the boundary of both of these tangles is of 4-punctured 2-sphere. So now we can take the traceless SU2 character variety of each of these 3 spaces. So we just did the 4-punctured sphere as an example. So we know that this gives us the pillowcase. I'll draw and fold it again like this. And then for the sake of example, let's say that this this tangle gives us a circle for its character variety, and this one gives us an interval. Then, since any representation on the tangle can be restricted to the boundary, that gives us maps from these character varieties into the pillowcase. And so maybe the circle maps in like this, and the arc maps in like this. And it turns out that these maps will always give us Lagrangians of our symplectic manifold. And the goal is to extract information from our original knot based on the interaction of these Lagrangians in the pillowcase. And so at least the naive idea about how to do that would be to take the Lagrangian Floer homology. So there, our chain complex is generated by intersections of these 2 Lagrangians. And our differential comes from counting pseudo-holomorphic strips whose boundaries are the 2 Lagrangians. And using these, you can take the homology. And so part of what I want to talk about today is sort of, to what extent does this strategy of just taking the Lagrangian Floer homology work or fail? In particular, to be an invariant, we would want to make sure that the homology doesn't depend on which decomposition you chose. And so we'll talk about that. First, I want to mention something that I glossed over before, which is perturbations, which is key to both the instanton definition and the character variety setting. So in singular instanton homology, the Chern-Simons function is usually not Morse, which means you can't take the Floer homology. And for character varieties, the character variety of a tangle is usually not a manifold. In particular, you're not going to get a Lagrangian of the pillowcase if you just take the character variety. And here are some examples of some typical, character varieties you might encounter, something singular like this, but you might even have something with higher dimensional components, like these 2 examples. And so both of these problems can be solved using something called holonomy perturbations. And the main piece of data for a holonomy perturbation is a family of perturbation curves, which are just loops in the tangle complement. So here's our tangle from before, and this in red is an example of what could be a perturbation curve. In the instanton case, what this means is you're in a tubular neighborhood of this curve, you're perturbing the flatness conditions. So you're no longer looking for flat connections, but connections which are flat outside of a tubular neighborhood of this curve and satisfy a slightly different condition near the curve. It's a little harder to say what the interpretation is in the character variety case, but in any case, you start with these singular character varieties, and applying these holonomy perturbations will smooth them out so that you can get Lagrangians. Another thing I wanted to mention was sort of the similarity with this strategy of Hedden, Herald, and Kirk with a different approach by Verheim and Woodward, which they call their Floer field theory for tangles. And the idea there is quite similar, except you starting with your knot, you can decompose your knot into tangles along many surfaces, potentially more complicated than spheres, and it can intersect your knot as many times as you want. And so you get much finer decompositions, and each resulting tangle is simpler, which is nice because that can guarantee that the Lagrangians you get are embedded in your symplectic manifolds. On the other hand, in the strategy I presented above or before, the Lagrangians in the pillowcase are generally immersed. And that's sort of the main hurdle of this strategy of Hedden, Herald, and Kirk, is that now we have to deal with immersed Lagrangians. But for that hurdle, we get an upside, which is because we're just using a 4-puncture 2-sphere, the symplectic manifold we're dealing with is the 2-dimensional pillowcase. And that means counting pseudo-homomorphic curves is equivalent to instead counting smooth immersed bigons, which is a much easier thing to do. So if we can get over this hurdle of immersed Lagrangians, the computations in this case are, relatively feasible, easier than doing them in Instanton homology, or generally easier than the Floer field theory idea. So yeah, so let's see how the Lagrangian Floer homology sort of compares to singular Instanton homology. So the first thing to notice is that the generators have a natural equivalence. So in our Lagrangian Floer homology, the generators come from these intersections in the pillowcase. What that means is that each of your two tangles has a representation, and those representations agree on the boundary, which means you can glue them together to get a representation of the entire knot complement. And we saw before that this sort of representation is equivalent to a flat connection. So we can go from intersections in the pillowcase to flat connections. Furthermore, there's this conjugation of representations going on in the character variety setting and modding out by gauge transformations in the Instanton setting. And those two, conjugating by an element of SU2 corresponds to doing a gauge transformation. And so there's this equivalence even after we mod out by gauge and by conjugation. Furthermore, both theories come with a Z4 grading on the generators, and this equivalence between generators respects this grading. The bigger issue is the differentials. So an instanton is an interpolation between two flat connections. Using bigons, you can get a similar interpolation, but what you get doesn't necessarily satisfy the right smoothness conditions to correspond to an instanton. So the differentials don't match up as nicely as the generators. Yeah, so let's see what we can tell about the Lagrangian Floer homology by looking at some examples. So Hedden, Herald, and Kirk sort of carry out this process for certain decompositions of two-bridge knots and torus knots. They can find certain decompositions where they can take the tangles, find their perturbed character varieties to get Lagrangians in the pillowcase, and take the Lagrangian Floer homology. However, it turns out that depending on how you decompose your knot, the resulting Lagrangian Floer homology could change. So it does depend on the decomposition. So the Lagrangian Floer homology itself isn't going to give you an invariant of your knot. And later on, we'll kind of see how you might be able to modify this to get an invariant. But one observation they made was that whenever, in any of the examples where your knot had a particularly nice decomposition, where one of your tangles is the trivial tangle with the earring, shown in this picture, and the other tangle sort of contains all the rest of the information for your knot, the Lagrangian Floer homology in that case always matched the known or conjectured value from singular Instanton homology. And so, yeah, my goals coming into this project were to generate more, understand this process for more examples, for more knots, and use that to kind of probe this observation a little more. So where can we get more examples? For that, we can look to the idea of tangle sums, which is due to John Conway. So for two tangles T and S and a parameterization of their boundary, we can define the tangle sum, which you get just by connecting sort of the two strands up here and the two strands down there and putting it in a new ball. So that's sort of what this picture here is. Hopefully it's kind of clear what happened. We just kind of smush these together. And right, the idea is if we understand the character variety of each of these two tangles that we're summing, can that help us understand the character variety of the tangle sum? And so to do that, I studied this tangle, which I called C3 down here. Hopefully you could see if I plugged in this tangle into this spot and this tangle into this spot, that the result would be this tangle sum. So this tangle sort of captures the information of this tangle sum operation. And by studying the character variety of this tangle, I was able to figure out how the character varieties of tangle sums behave. And then also, generally, you're going to end up with a singular character variety as a result, but we want Lagrangians, so we want to perturb. And so we can also understand the perturbed character variety of this tangle along this perturbation curve. So let's see what that looks like. So first, we want to understand the character variety of this C3 tangle. And first, I'll go through the unperturbed case. So it turns out to be easier if we work with a branch double cover of the character variety. So that's what I'll be talking about. And it turns out that the unperturbed character variety has looks like a T3 intersecting two S2 cross S1s. So first of all, one thing to notice is that the boundary of C3 was four punctured spheres. And so the character variety of the boundary is the product of three pillowcases. So we expect something roughly half-dimensional. And so we do get a three-dimensional character variety. So this is my interpretation of a picture for this character variety. So here I have this annulus, which is sort of shaded in. It has these two boundary components, this inner circle and the outer circle. If I identify those, I can turn my annulus into a torus. And then there's this extra S1 factor, which gives me my 3 torus. In this picture, there's also these two spheres. And then taking into account this extra S1 factor gives us our two S2 cross S1s. So one thing to notice is that this character variety is singular. Here where the spheres intersect this annulus, you see I have these two circles. When I take into account this extra S1 factor, that tells me that the singular set of this character variety is actually 2 tori. And so that's sort of an issue. When I take the character variety of a tangle sum, it's going to end up being cut out of this character variety. And in general, it's going to cut out these singularities. It's going to cut through this singular set, which will end up with, so I'll end up with a character variety of a tangle sum that has singularities in it. So let's see what that might look like. So here's my tangle sum example. So these two tangles here are just what are known as rational tangles. They're particularly easy to understand their character varieties. In each case, the character variety is just an interval, and the interval maps into the pillowcase in these two ways. And the goal is to understand the character variety of the tangle sum just from the information that's in these two pictures, without actually looking at any representations from the fundamental group here into SU2, just by putting these two pictures together. And I'll explain how you do that in a second, but the first thing to notice is that the result I get when I do that is this singular space. So I have this interval that intersects this circle, which gives me these two singularities that maps into the pillowcase in a way that's not so straightforward to see right away, but the top half of this circle and the bottom half of this circle both get mapped to this interval here, which is of course the same as this interval down here. So first I squish the circle, then I can map it into the pillowcase like this. So how can we go from these two pictures to this picture? So whenever I have a representation of this tangle and a representation of this tangle whose gamma coordinates agree, then there's a representation of C3, which is compatible with both of them, and I can glue those representations together to get a representation of the tangle sum. And when I do that, I can take the theta value of this representation and add it to the theta value of this representation. And then the resulting theta value here is sort of the negation of that. So we take that value and start from the top and go down, and we get this here. So, there were two possible representations here, three possible representations here with this gamma value. So putting those, all the different combinations, to combine those, we get 6 at the same gamma value in the tangle sum. So this explains where the blue part of this character variety comes from. In addition, something special happens when you're gluing together representations that live on the edge of the pillowcase. So here's one representation on the edge of the pillowcase for this tangle. Here's one over here. And now when you look for representations of C3 to glue these representations together, there's not just one, but there's a whole circle's worth. And so that's where this circle comes from, and it'll map as an interval on this edge of the pillowcase. And so one thing to note here is that there are other representations on the edges of these pillowcases, but for any other combination you want to try, one of them will actually be on the corner. In that case, you get sort of a degenerate circle, and so you don't use, it's the same as, just getting a point, just getting one representation in the sum. So in this case, this is the only interesting way to combine representations on the edge, leading to just one circle here. Cool, so this explains how we can get the character variety of tangle sums, but again, we want Lagrangians, and so we need to perturb, because right now we have a singular character variety. So we can start by just perturbing the character variety of C3, and that'll end up sort of all at once resolving all of our possible tangle sums, instead of perturbing them each on an individual basis. By understanding this one perturbation, that'll tell us how to perturb the character variety of any tangle sum. So here was our schematic for our unperturbed character variety. It lives inside of this 6-dimensional product of 3 pillowcases, but inside of that, it naturally lives inside of some 4-dimensional space. And so I can ask, if I pick a singular point, what does the neighborhood of that point look like inside this 4-dimensional space? And for any singular point in the unperturbed character variety, it'll look like sort of, the singularity of this cross times a D2. That's what the singularities look like. And what we want to know is, when I turn on that perturbation, what happens in the neighborhood of each singular point? How does the singularity resolve? And there's 4 possible cases for what happens. So the first 2 are the generic cases, which come from resolving this singularity of the cross. So there's 2 ways to smooth out that singularity, and then still just multiplying by the D2. One thing that can happen as I sort of transition from one case to the other is that I'll get a saddle across an interval. And then lastly, when we perturb, there are still going to be a couple points which are singular, which will be cones on tori. So, right, these are the possibilities, but the question is, how does, for each singular point, which of these possibilities happen? And luckily, our singular set is 2 tori. So let's focus on one torus for now. They both work the same way. So for a torus, we can draw a torus as this square, and for each singular point, we can map out which of these 4 cases happens. So in this case, one of these axes is this circle component. The other one comes from this S1 component. I don't remember off the top of my head which is which, but the idea here is that you can pick a singular point, see where in the torus it lives with respect to some parameterization, and then this tells me how that singular point resolves when I turn on my perturbation. So in a red region, it's going to perturb this way. In a blue region, it'll perturb this way. Along these black lines that separate the 2 regions, you'll get your saddles. And then at these green points, those are still going to be singular points, and now they're cones on tori. So again, this is a torus, so really there's just 4 singular points per torus. Both tori perturb the same way, so there's still 8 singular points in the end. So our goal was to smooth out the character variety. We still have a couple singular points, but that turns out not to be an issue. When we look at how this character variety maps to our product of 3 pillowcases, these remaining singular points map to the product of 3 corners of our pillowcases. And so when we're concerned about our symplectic manifold, we're only looking at the smooth stratum, which doesn't care about the corners. And so since we're throwing out the corners anyways, these singular points don't matter because they're just mapping to those corners that we're throwing away. So for what's going on inside the symplectic manifold, this smooths everything out. And then, so one way to think about this smooth character variety is, if this is meaningful to you, you can think of it as a Lagrangian cobordism from the product of 2 pillowcases down to 1 pillowcase. So now we know how this character variety perturbs. Let's see what effect this has on what we're really interested in, which are these character varieties of tangle sums. So this is our example from before. It's going to be easier to talk about now if we sort of view it differently. So we're going to cut along this dotted line and glue it in a way so that these 2 edges line up, so that these 2 red intervals, they really represent the same interval, so we want to match those up. So when we do that, locally, the picture sort of looks like this. So I have my red circle, which has been smushed down, and it meets these arc components singularly. When you take the tangle sum, all the singularities sort of have this same form. And so we want to understand what happens in this picture when we turn on our perturbation. One thing I'll note is that in this example, we also have this blue component which goes through the middle of the red circle, but that's only an artifact of the map to the pillowcase. So they map to the same point in the pillowcase, but in the actual character variety, the point on this blue arc doesn't intersect the red circle. So locally, our picture looks like this. We want to understand how it perturbs. And so the way we can do that is by looking at these 2 singular points. So each of these singular points, so it's a singularity in the character variety of the tangle sum. We can restrict that character variety to the part of that tangle sum which makes up the C3 tangle, which means each of these singularities lives somewhere on these 2 tori that are part of this singular set. So if I know where they land on these tori, I can ask, where do they live with respect to this picture? And I can figure out how each singularity resolves when I turn on my perturbation. And things work out really nicely. It turns out that my 2 singularities, one will always land in a red region, one will always land in a blue region. So what that means is I have these 2 singularities, and when I turn on my perturbation, they'll always resolve in a complementary way. And as a result, the perturbed character variety will always replace this singular thing with this X. So before a priori, it could have perturbed in a way where these 2 get connected, and these two strands get connected, and we could kind of pull them apart. But it turns out that it'll always perturb in a way where we get this X. And so I can apply that to my picture of the character variety. And now after perturbing, I know it looks something like this. And, so the perturbed picture here is really only up to isotopy, but that's in terms of computing Lagrange Floer homologies, that's what's important. So I've explained what the character variety of C3 looks like, unperturbed and perturbed, and we've seen how we can use that to find the character varieties of tangle sums. So what can we do with that information? So first of all, these methods are particularly good for understanding the character varieties of what are called arborescent tangles or knots. So those are the ones where they're constructed by starting with rational tangles, whose character varieties are well understood, and then doing repeated summing. So I take rational tangles and I sum them together. Maybe I can rotate my result by 90 degrees and sum that to some more rational tangles and so on. So we understand the character varieties of rational tangles, and we understand what summing does to the character variety. And so, by repeated applications of the process I explained, we can get the character varieties for these special tangles and knots quite easily. Easily enough that I wrote a program in Sage, which can start with right now a pretzel knot and compute these character varieties. With a little more work, it'll work for any arborescent knot, and then take the Lagrange Floer homology of the Lagrangians. So with the picture in the pillowcase, there's a couple nice things that this can give us. So first of all, just looking at the intersections, this gives us a set of generators for the instanton chain complex. Using that, you can get a bound on the rank of instanton homology. So there's other bounds. So you get an upper bound. So other upper bounds come from that spectral sequence from Kovanov homology, but there are cases when the bounds from this method are tighter bounds than the ones coming from Kovanov homology. So without taking any homology, without looking at any differentials, just by looking at the intersections in the pillowcase, we can learn more about singular instanton homology by getting these new bounds. Another useful thing we can do with these pictures is learn about Chern-Simons invariants of knots. And so the idea there is, by looking at the flat connections on the knot, like I described earlier in the construction of instanton homology, you might want to know what the image is of those flat connections under the Chern-Simons function. And my colleague at IU, Mark Ronenberg, has worked on a way to calculate these Chern-Simons invariants from this picture of two Lagrangians in the pillowcase. And so with these new examples, that we can easily compute these Chern-Simons invariants for knots, especially these arborescent knots, which are work nicely with the sum operation. So of these arborescent knots, maybe families of knots that are a subset of arborescent knots that are maybe a little more familiar are Montesinos knots or pretzel knots. And so what I did was I looked at pretzel knots. So here, the box with a P, Q, and R, those represent having, P, Q, or R half twists of your knot inside there. What I could do is look at these special decompositions where one tangle is trivial with an earring and the other contains all the information of the knot, but I could do that for this pretzel knot in 3 different ways. I could pull out the part with P twists, the part with Q twists, the part with R twists. Here, there's twists, so it's not exactly the same as a trivial tangle with, in terms of the picture I showed you before, but, topologically they're the same. And they have equivalent Lagrangian Floer homologies in the pillowcase. So I can look at these three different decompositions and ask, what are the Lagrangian Floer homologies before all the examples of this type had Lagrangian Floer homologies, which matched up with singular instanton homology. So is that the case? Do they even agree with each other? And when you do this, you can find examples where these three Lagrangian Floer homologies are actually different. So for example, the -3, 5, 7 pretzel knot, if I take these three different decompositions, I get the following homologies. So remember, it's Z4 graded, so these are the ranks in each of the Z4 gradings, but the total rank of the instanton homology is 15 in one case, 5 in another case, and 1 in another case. We know the only knot that can have instanton homology rank 1 is the unknot. So this is a very extreme wrong answer. And so that tells us that, well, yeah, and so for this particular knot, result of Lobb and Zentner tells us that the actual rank of instanton homology is somewhere between 11 and 15. But this tells us that even with this special decomposition, where one of our tangles is trivial, that just taking the normal Lagrangian Floer homology does depend on your decomposition and perturbation, and is not an invariant of your knot. So how can this be fixed? So just taking the Lagrangian Floer homology isn't an invariant of your knot, isn't going to recover instanton homology. Sort of going forward, what is the correct way to define the differential? So the generators match up. We want to keep the generators of this chain complex to be the intersections in the pillowcase. But following ideas of Botman and Verheim, the reason why these Lagrangian Floer homologies don't match up is because we have immersed Lagrangians. And that leads to a phenomenon called figure-8 bubbling. And so it's conjectured that for your tangle, the data you really want isn't just a Lagrangian, but a Lagrangian in the pillowcase along with a bounding cochain. And a bounding cochain of a Lagrangian is just a linear combination of the self-intersections of the Lagrangian satisfying a Moore-Cartan equation. And using that extra data, differentials are then calculated instead of just counting smooth immersed bigons, by counting smooth immersed polygons of potentially higher order, where the bounding cochains dictate which self-intersections can be used as vertices of these polygons. And the idea is that if you can figure out how to assign bounding cochains to your tangle, hopefully that data will correct for the differences you get when you change decomposition and give, first of all, a well-defined not invariant independent of your choices, but secondly, something that's isomorphic to instanton homology. And so in light of this perspective, sort of the result on the previous slide could tell you that, even in this special case where you decompose into a trivial tangle and the rest of your knot, that you're not always going to have trivial bounding cochains, that, if this strategy works out, you do actually, there will be bounding cochains that you have to worry about and compute. And yeah, hopefully, I'm hoping that, with these extra examples I've generated that shows the failure of the Lagrangian Floer homology to be an invariant, those will provide sort of useful places to start to investigate, what bounding cochains can be used to correct for the differences and how that might behave. Yeah, so that's what I had to say. Thank you for listening.
All right, any questions for Kai? So maybe I'll start with one. So near the end, when you were talking about your program that computes the perturbed character variety, can you say what it means to compute that character variety?
Yeah. So, first of all, it can, given a pretzel knot, it'll generate this sort of picture in the pillowcase. But then again, we want to perturb. So, right, this picture I gave you of a perturbed character variety is only really up to isotopy. But if I sort of take my perturbation and scale it down close to 0, this is going to limit to sort of this straight line, piecewise linear picture, but with things still connected the right way, where like this, this is connected and this piece is connected. And there's no longer, the circle with singularities. So it'll generate that sort of piecewise linear picture of the character variety in the pillowcase. And then using those, it'll, it can start looking for intersections and these smooth immersed bigons, that sort of thing, and compute the homology.
Okay, so the thing that your program will output is the pillowcase together with an immersed submanifold, immersed curve.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Mhm.
Okay, any more questions for Kai?
Yes. So did you try to guess the bounding cochain in your example?
Yeah, that's something is something I'm going to look a little more closely in the future. So with these small examples, where must the bounding cochains be if they're going to correct for this? So this particular example, I think there's a couple of easier examples to start with, where maybe 2 of these homologies match and one of them is different, and there's not as many self-intersections. But I haven't yet really figured out where the bounding cochains have to come up, but that's something I would like to explore more in the future.
So those bounding cochains, would you be thinking of getting them by like getting your hands on the relevant spaces of figure eights?
I think that's one thing I'm interested in looking at. I still have more to understand about these things. So, I think at least with simple examples, that should be doable. But also there's certain cases where, for example, maybe one picture has no self-intersections. If another picture has one self-intersection and a different homology, you can ask, does making this one self-intersection a bounding cochain correct the homology? And at least in one similar example, the answer is yes. And so that would lead you to say, like, okay, in this one case, we would know the bounding cochain would have to be here. It's really the only option, and it does correct the homology. But for more complicated cases, I don't know if that's a, sort of this process of elimination is a feasible way to figure things out. But I think I'm interested in, getting my hands dirty with the figure eight bubbling.
Okay, I guess I have one more question.
Yeah.
When you were talking about your computer programs, so what's special about the families of knots that you are considering there?
Yeah, so those are particularly simple because it starts, the building blocks are these rational tangles where the character variety is just arc mapped in linearly into the pillowcase. And so summing those together gives a particularly nice character variety because everything ends up being piecewise linear. So you can just get the resulting character variety as, a bunch of line segments, which is nice for the computer to work with. But in general, there's not very many other building blocks where the character variety is understood. There's a couple that come from decomposing torus knots from Hedden, Herald, and Kirk's paper. And so, we know what those character varieties look like. You could sum those with, other parts of torus knots or rational tangles, that sort of thing. And that, that works fine. But since the character varieties you're starting with that come from those torus knots are more complicated, in terms of what I do on the computer, I would need to, have it understand what the exact curves are, everything. It's easier to start out with just these sort of linear character varieties. But in theory, you can answer any of these questions with sums of different pieces other than rational tangles. Those are just particularly easy places to start.
Okay, any more questions for Kai? Okay, if not, then let's give Kai another hand.